The whole story that took place on the day of the emancipation, how people were dressed. They were mainly in white and they all had a piece of red somewhere adorned. The women, a red ribbon around the waist, and the men had a red ribbon around their hat. And that was for the freedom, the sign of freedom.
Welcome to Whispers of the Past. I'm your host, Fee David, and this is Freedom in July. In this episode, we turn to the years 1850 to 1900, with a focus on 1863, a date etched into the history of the Dutch Caribbean as the year slavery was formally abolished. But emancipation on paper did not mean liberation in life. Across the Caribbean, formerly enslaved people stepped into the new reality. No land, no compensation, no real support, and yet, in the absence of justice, they built something else. What does it mean to be free when freedom arrives empty-handed? What does liberation look like when it comes not from moral reckoning, but through legal systems by those who never fully acknowledged that slavery is a crime against humanity? On St. Eustatius, the answers echoed in rhythms and rituals, bottles knocked in defiance, ribbons tied in red. Songs sung by women who had waited too long to be seen. In this episode, we explore what came after emancipation, not just the loss, but the legacy. Through memory, migration, and quiet revolution, station women helped shape the freedom of their own making. But before we arrive in 1863, we must understand what came before, because for enslaved women, especially mothers, the fight for freedom began long before it was ever declared. Their resistance often took place not on the battlefield, but in the home, in the desperate effort to hold onto their children, their dignity, and their futures. To begin, historian Dr. Allain offers us a regional overview and sheds light on the emotional aftermath of slavery and the enduring strength of those who endured it.
Some imperial systems had stricter laws about mother and child separation than others, right? So, it wasn't uniform across time and space, this practice of mother and child separation. But I will say, even in the French Caribbean, where it was technically illegal to separate mothers and children, at least during the period that I study, probably in earlier periods as well, it was very common for slaveholders to sort of not sell children away from their mothers, but to give them away sort of informally so that they could evade detection by the law. So there were ways in which mothers and children were separated, even when they weren't technically supposed to be legally. If we read archival documents carefully, we can actually learn quite a bit about enslaved people's, emotional inner world and the relationships they had with each other. And that includes relationships between mothers and children. We know that in most slave societies, women fought very hard to spare their children from slavery. So I was looking at some documents pertaining to a woman named Sophie Lite, who was born in Martinique, but was living in Trinidad in 1847, at which point slavery had been abolished in the British colonies, but not the French. Lite appealed to the British Crown for help freeing her children, whom she alleged were being held in slavery illegally in Martinique. This is just one example of many stories from across the Caribbean of women trying to pursue legal means of freeing their children from slavery. And in Lite's case, the government actually declined to help her. But every so often, we do find instances of the law intervening on enslaved mothers' behalves. Also, enslaved or formerly enslaved women sometimes try to buy their children's freedom. So in the French Caribbean, this practice was called rachat, or redemption. So women would buy their freedom or their children's freedom from slaveholders. In many slave societies, women could sometimes earn a small income by selling fruits and vegetables and other goods they grew on small plots of land. And in some cases, they were able to use this money save it up, and then purchase themselves or their children. And then finally, in many different slave societies, we find records of enslaved women complaining to local authorities about the ill treatment of their children. For example, I have looked at records from the French Caribbean that show enslaved women lodging complaints against slave owners for physically harming their children or for not providing their children with enough food and clothing. And we can find similar records in other parts of the Caribbean as well, especially during the latter decades of slavery, during which time there existed more of a legal infrastructure to support slaves' claims against owners.
For enslaved mothers across the Caribbean, separation from their children was one of the most profound and enduring forms of trauma. Laws varied between empires. Even when protection technically existed, like in the French colonies, it was common for enslavers to exploit loopholes and informally remove children from their mother's care. In the Dutch Caribbean, archival records are still limited. One rare example comes from Curaçao, where an enslaved woman named Virginie challenged the colonial authorities for her freedom and that of her children. Her successful legal fight is one of the few documented cases where an enslaved mother confronted the Dutch state and won. Stories like Virginie's suggest there may be many more hidden acts of resistance within the Dutch Caribbean. Those stories are yet to be uncovered. Further research, particularly through oral history and neglected archives, may reveal the depth of these struggles. But even now, the emotional legacy is clear. The forced rupture of families inflicted deep psychological wounds, wounds that echo across generations. And then came emancipation in 1863. The Dutch government finally abolished slavery, but only after securing compensations for the slave owners, not for the enslaved. Those who had endured a lifetime of suffering were given nothing, no land, no wages, no resources, and many were forced to keep working under exploitive contracts, and some, seeking better opportunities, began to leave the islands altogether. On St. Eustatius, where slavery had also ended, emancipation brought hardship instead of celebration. As Mrs. Soutekouw, a long-term resident and one of the founders of the Center of Archaeological Research, explains, this was a moment when Statia would have been rising. Instead, it fell into economic decline. Freed people had few options and little support. Former slaveholders abandoned their plantation, leaving behind a community that's free in name, but struggling to survive.
Well, the Dutch were very late in abolishing slavery. They were really forced into it because of Saint Martin. Because in Saint Martin, on the French side, they were free. So it was easy for them to get to the French side or to Anguilla, be free. So the Dutch government agreed to the abolishment of slavery only out of necessity. They really didn't have a choice. But instead of rewarding the slaves that were being abolished, they actually compensated the slave owners for abolishing slavery. It's a deplorable fact that the people who were actually enslaving them made more from it than the slaves themselves, who were suddenly set free with no income. So what did they have to do? They had to work for the same people at much decreased wages or try to find something else to do. But instead of staying around, same slave owners left the island because they didn't have the workers to produce the crops that they needed, and they began to desert the plantations. Statia went into great decline at the very time it should have been celebrating and expanding itself because now our people were free. But their opportunities here were very limited.
The abolition of slavery in Dutch Caribbean came not as a triumph of morality, but as a reluctant response to mounting pressure, especially from neighboring islands like the French side of Saint Martin, where freedom had already been taken. As Mrs. Soutekouw reminds us, emancipation did not come with reparation for the formerly enslaved. Instead, compensation flowed to the former slaveholders, while those who actually endured generations of bondage were left without land, income, or any real opportunity. And yet, in the face of injustice and abandonment, something remarkable unfolded. Across St. Eustatius, the spirit of liberation stirred not only quiet resilience, but public defiance, led in many cases by women, whose name may be lost to history, but whose voices carried through the street on the first Emancipation Day. To guide us deeper into that moment, we turn to the Island Heritage Inspector, Mr. Richardson, who brings to life the powerful and unexpected ways this day was claimed, not by decree, but by the people themselves.
So it's July 1st, 1863. That's when slavery was abolished. And then again, you see there's a huge demographical shift on the island of people. There are formerly enslaved people that became Methodists through the preachings of Black Harry.
In the years before emancipation, the seed of spiritual resistance were already taken roots across the Caribbean. And on St. Eustatius, one voice rose above the rest. His name was Black Harry. His real name, birthplace, and date of death remain unknown. To clear up any confusion, around the same time in the United States, another African-American Methodist preacher named Harry Hosier was also known as Black Harry. And though the parallels in their lives are very striking, historians have agreed that they are not the same person. Black Harry on St. Eustatius left behind a legacy that was uniquely Statian, one of defiance and spiritual awakening. He arrived on the island as a free man of color in the late 1700s, during a time where enslaved people were forbidden to gather for worship. Yet, Harry preached anyway, his sermons full of fire, hope, and uncompromising truth. He drew crowds, stirred hearts, and offered strength to those still in bondage. Colonial authorities quickly saw his influence as dangerous. He was banned from preaching, he was punished, and ultimately he was exiled from the island. But his message could not be silenced. Today, his legacy lives on in the Bethel Methodist Church and on Black Harry Lane, named in his honor. His story is not just about faith, it's about resistance and the power of one voice to move people. It's no surprise then that by the time emancipation finally arrived in 1863, spiritual conviction and community resilience were already woven into the fabric of the island. And as Heritage Inspector Mr. Richardson explains, something extraordinary emerged on the first Emancipation Day.
There's a large group of people on the island that are non-religious. And that's an interesting group because this is a group now that lives in what they call the north of the island. It's not geographically the north, but it's referred to as the north, as they would say locally. And what you see is that it's still called the north, actually. And to show you how people are proud of the north, you remember recently we got our first female governor, Miss Alida Francis, and she was also referred to as the girl from the north. And you remember that the north is going to be a very part of the Statia colloquial landscape and cultural landscape. So it's July 1st, 1863. The governor at the time is Gouverneur Roos van Toningen. And he reads the proclamation in the Bethel Methodist Church in the morning at around 7 that people are free. And everyone is, thanking God. Those that have been converted to Methodism. And also the Dutch Reformed Church. So it's really interesting because now inside of the church, you have the kind of white station population and the black station population all sitting together. But from the north, there's a disturbance. There's a loud drumming and there's a chant. And people are waving red flowers in the air. And you can guess who that was being led by. It was being led by women. The women were knocking bottles together, to create some kind of symphony. And the men were drumming behind, and the women were the ones doing the singing. And they were singing very loud, happy, happy July day. I don't give a damn what the masters say. I'm free, I'm free, I'm free today. humbug can't humbug me. So there's a whole chant that and they're coming from way out in the countryside and they're marching all the way into town, showing that they're free. They're not religious either. They don't belong to any church, which is also interesting. And what makes it interesting is that though in the former slave registers, they were labeled as Protestants, they were not. They weren't baptized. And that you had that on station for a long time. And you see that these women now are chanting, coming through the streets. The governor writes it in his letter to The Hague, describing how the day went. And you see that these women are going to become the instigators of everything that's going to become. Because out of the north, as they say, that's where the power. And you would see that eventually as we get into the 20th and the 21st century, where that Northness will then come back in the empowerment of a lot of women on St. Eustatius or women of color of the island in general. And you would see why people are proud of that, because also to note that Mama Didier, Francis Coffey, they're all also from the north. So they're not from what is called Down Street or the South. They're all women from the north. So the north was always the fighting force of defying slavery.
Freedom on St. Eustatius did not arrive in silence. It came with rhythm of bottles and drums. As Mr. Richardson reminds us, it was the women from the north who led the charge, singing through the streets, red flowers in hand, declaring themselves free in a world that had long refused to see their humanity. Though listed as Protestant in the old slave registers, many of these women belonged to no church. Their resistance wasn't shaped by doctrine. It was born of lived experience, ancestral strength, and the refusal to be defined by colonial categories. But emancipation was more than a moment. It became a memory, passed down through generations. And in these stories, we find details history often overlooks. Governor Lady Alida Francis, a daughter of the North, carries these memories not only as a leader, but as a descendant of those who once sang freedom into being.
The whole story that took place on the day of the emancipation, how people were dressed, you learned that they were dressed mainly in white and they all had a piece of red somewhere adorned on the women, the red ribbon I was told around the waist, and the men had a red ribbon around their hat. And that was for the freedom, the sign of freedom. They danced with what we call the July flower, known as the flamboyant flower. So there are stories still that are alive, but they're hidden away.
On St. Eustatius, story of emancipation have long been held not only in records but in memory, passed down through families, preserved in song, and marked by ritual. Governor Lady Alida Francis recalls the details that oral tradition never forgot. White garments adorned with red, the July flower clutched in hand, and the quiet pride stitched into every ribbon. These symbols of freedom were not random. Red ribbons, flamboyant blossom, the colors of joy and resistance worn with intention. But memory doesn't only live in official ceremonies. It breathes through folklore. Those stories whispered from one generation to the next, shaped as much by feeling as by fact. Dr. Zahidi, an archaeologist who lived and worked on the island, shared one such story. Whether it happened exactly as told is beside the point. What matters is what it means, and how its symbolism still pulses through the island's collective identity.
One of the most powerful ones for me, there's a story that's told often on Statia, and that is the story of Emancipation Day on July 1st, 1863, when the newly emancipated took their blue beads and they threw them from the cliffs into the sea. And when you picture that in your mind, you can kind of envision people throwing the beads from the cliffs, and you can feel that power, that emotion, and that resistance, and that subversive action symbolized so much. And it still does, it's still entangled with the way that people on St. Eustatius view their ancestors, but also how they view themselves. It's peaceful and steady, but really strong. And that story, I think, is such a powerful statement about colonialism and anti-colonialism. And that memory is held so closely by people today, I think, not just because of its historical importance, but because that spirit of resistance and self-agency is still very much entangled in the contemporary lives of people on the island. It's still relevant.
The image of blue beads cast into the sea, free falling from the cliffs, like a final farewell to bondage, reminds us that liberation is not just about breaking away. It's also about what comes next. And in the years that followed, the spirit of self-determination did not fade. It evolved quietly, steadily, into a new form of resistance and renewal. By the late 19th century, another kind of transformation began to unfold. This time, not through revolt, but through rebuilding. This new presence on the island were the Dominican sisters. They arrived from Europe, not just as missionaries, but as educators, caretakers, and community builders. Part of the century-old Dominican order, founded in 1216 and grounded in study, service, prayer, and community, their mission on Statia took root in deeply practical ways. As Mr. Richardson reflects, their work became more than religious instruction. The sisters helped raise classrooms from stone, trained the island's first local teachers, and supported women in shaping the social fabric of the community. The same hands that once carried red flowers in celebration now lifted building blocks of schools, churches, and possibilities. Holy preaching wasn't always done in words. It was seen in actions. And this was a different kind of resistance, rooted in care, education, and quiet empowerment.
Yeah, so the Dominican sisters, they came in around the late 1890s, I think, to the island. They had an interesting service of about 99 years on station. That's a long time. And quite recently, one of the last sisters died, I think, last year in the Netherlands. She returned many years after. She was also one of the first teachers of the Catholic school. But the Dominican nuns, they come in the time that there's not an established Catholic church. What is a beautiful story of someone, I grew up in the Catholic church, so what I do know about the role of the women's club. This is something that was started, of course, there are these European nuns coming from already established Europe to a small Caribbean island as missionaries, but then realize that their work are so in-depth, more in-depth than missionaries. And guess who become the pillars of society also because of working with these Dominican nuns? It's the station women. They are more than just converts to Catholicism. They are really the spearhead of the community, of the social structure of the community, the welfare of the community, together with these nuns. So you see that the women kind of band together to kind of formalize themselves now together with these nuns. And the nuns then, they start, one thing that was instrumental is the building of the current Catholic Church. There are pictures and documents of women bringing the blocks up the slave path, not men. The men were the stonemasons, but the women as parishioners brought the stones up, the bay path as we know it, and it's quite steep. And it's something that they were very proud of. So you see that the resilience of the women are now like, hey, I'm a woman, but I'm not feeble. And you see that in this mixture of the Dominican nuns, you see also that music starts to play a huge role. Not only music as in the song and dance that Statia is known for, but the structural learning of music. They also started a school here. And you would see the first teachers or the first kindergarten teachers for buitenschool. It's interesting. They get their teaching from these Dominican nuns and get their qualifications to teach on the island from these Dominican nuns and not even from an institution in Europe. So you see that the Dominican nuns on the island don't only install religion, they kind of install kind of freedom and entrepreneurship And then you see that out of the Dominican nuns, a lot of structures start to go in place. Women start to really lead the society in different locations. And you see that the influence of the Dominican nuns and the establishment of the school isn't even only for Catholics, but it's also for the Methodists on the island, the Dutch Reform, basically for everyone. And you see that there's a period of kind of, I would say peaceful unity, because you also see it in governing letters and at the time. And these Dominican nuns were really instrumental in the current position of women today and also the fight for women today. And you would see that this early installment of the Dominican nuns on the island and that 99-year-long reign is going to produce a lot of strong-willed women who eventually are the grandparents and parents of many of the stations here today. And it's all because of that influence of that period between 1890 onwards.
Mr. Richardson reminds us, the Dominican sisters arrived not only with scripture, but with structure. Their mission, rooted in education and community service, wove new threads into the social fabrics of post-emancipation Statia. With them, island women built more than churches and schools. They cultivated leadership, kinship, and quiet revolutions of care. But the path forward for Caribbean women did not follow a single course. While some found purpose in new institutions, others charted different routes, out of necessity, resistance, or survival. As Dr. Allain explains, across the region, many women chose not to return to the same fields that once exploited them. The end of slavery did not mean the end of struggle. It did open the door for women to redefine their roles in ways that's powerfully shaped the post-emancipation Caribbean.
In the sort of years following slavery in the British Caribbean, historians have documented that a lot of women actually left plantation labor. So they decided that they simply were not going to work on plantations anymore for a wage. They were going to grow their own crops for sale and whatnot. This caused a major panic among plantation owners, right? Because they needed those women's labor. Generally speaking, though, across the Caribbean, the majority of women continued to work as plantation laborers. So in the French Caribbean, for instance, some women did field work, but most, because of a lack of available land, had to continue working on plantations. Some historians have thought of women's retreat from the fields as a sort of retreat into domesticity, as a sort of like attempt to become proper women in a sort of European sense of the term proper womanhood. But I think the more likely explanation is that field labor was simply horrendously hard on the body, extremely taxing in all sorts of different ways. And women just didn't, as much as possible, didn't want to be subject to the kind of abuse that took place on plantation.
Their refusal to return to the fields was more than a practical decision. It was a statement, a rejection of a system that had long devalued their bodies, their time, and their freedom. In choosing to step away, Caribbean women began to redefine what work and what worth could mean in a new world, still shaped by the old one.
So, women were obviously really, really important members of their societies after the abolition of slavery. There's been a lot of discussion about the phenomenon of matrifocal households. So this idea that sort of during slavery and after slavery, women were the heads of households and men weren't really involved. And I think that has been exaggerated to some degree. And in fact, men of African descent very often were very involved in their children's lives. And, so we don't want to exaggerate the extent to which households were matrifocal. But at the same time, it is true that, women took a primary role in raising children. They often were heads of household, and they were, often very respected members of their communities. I don't want to downplay, misogyny and patriarchy, but we definitely have lots of evidence of women of African descent across the Caribbean sort of not playing the role of demure little housewife, right? Of being sort of out in public and sort of having quite a bit of authority in their cultures. And, they weren't necessarily seen as respectable in the eyes of Europeans, right? Or in the eyes of elite people of African descent. They weren't necessarily seen as demure, staying inside the house. They sort of enacted their own vision of womanhood in a lot of different ways. And, sometimes they did take part in labor militancy. In 1870 in Martinique, there was a major uprising. A lot of plantations were burnt by field workers. It was very violent. And women played a part in that. And one of them was named Lumina, or her nickname was Supplice, and she was actually hanged for her involvement in this rebellion. There are myriad examples of women taking part in that kind of rebellious militant activity in the period following slavery.
Across the Caribbean, as Dr. Allain reminds us, women were not retreating into the shadows. They were reshaping society on their own terms. Choosing not to return to the fields was not just about labor, it was about reclaiming ownership of their time, their bodies, and their future. But, unfortunately, emancipation had not leveled the playing field. The end of slavery did not come with land, wages, or justice. It came with absence. Absence of support, absence of infrastructure, of the very promises freedom should have fulfilled. On St. Eustatius, the absence became its own kind of exodus. The plantation economy crumbled, and with it, opportunities dried up. Families made impossible choices. Some stayed, rooted in place, while others left in search for something more. And so, just as women across the region found ways to resist through presence, many stations would begin to resist through movement. Migration became its own form of survival. Next, Mrs. Soutekouw reflects on what that movement meant, not just for those who left, but for the island they left behind.
This was the beginning of the migration of people from Eustatius to other islands. They were going to other islands. That migration would really take off in the early 1900s as the refineries in Curacao and other islands, and also development of tourism on other islands, would offer positions and jobs to the people on Eustatius. So the Eustatius population began to decrease greatly by our own people as they went off island. By the 1900, most of the people that were left on the island were fishermen, farmers, grandparents, and small children. As the young adults, people who could make a living elsewhere, moved either up island to St. Thomas and St. Croix and places like that, or to the Puerto Ricos and other places, or down island to Curacao and Aruba, where there were opportunities in the whale industry. A lot of that took place right around the 1900s.
Freedom, when it came to the Dutch Caribbean, was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of reckoning. A proclamation read out loud could not just undo centuries of violence, nor could it rebuild the lives left fractured by bondage. And yet, from the silence of abandonment rose a new kind of resistance. Women led the way, not always with protest, but with presence. They sang freedom into the streets, carried stones up steep paths, and taught the next generation that dignity could not be stolen, only reclaimed. Their stories, tucked into folklore, wrapped in red ribbons, whispers in the voices of elders, continue to carry the weight of freedom still unfolding. Because emancipation was not the end of struggle, it was the beginning of memory. A memory not housed in monuments, but in movement, not bound to paper, but passed hand to hand, story to story. And if freedom lives on in ways we remember, then we must ask ourselves, what truths still remain hidden? What voices still go unheard? And what does it mean, not just to be free, but to stay free. In our next episode, we step into the 20th century, where the echoes of emancipation give rise to modern times and a new form of survival. The fight continues, not in chains, but in choices.